Good evening and welcome to the Davenport Greenway community conversation on the ecological benefits of plants and pollinators and how they support wildlife in the Greenway and surrounding communities. My name is Louisa Sadowski and I'm the Senior Manager of Community Engagement for the Toronto West GO expansion projects at Metrolinx, and it is my pleasure to be one of the moderators for this evening's event. Today's event is a different kind of event where we have experts available to answer your questions with a focus entirely about plants and pollinators and their habitats. We will define pollination later in this presentation as well, but I also wanted to share the definition at the very start. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from the male reproductive part of a flower, also known as the anther, to the female reproductive part, also known as the stigma. The vast majority of flowering plants depend on insects for pollination in order to reproduce. As you are looking at the screen, you'll note this event is being closed captioned. You can turn on closed captioning by clicking the CC icon button on your video player. So now we'll move on to the next slide for our land acknowledgement. So let us take a moment to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, as well as the Wendat peoples. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers and immigrants in this generation or generations past. Metrolinx declares its commitment to building meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the historic and continued impacts of colonization and the need to work towards meaningful reconciliation with the original caretakers of this land. We acknowledge that Metrolinx operates on lands covered by 20 treaties, and that we have a responsibility to recognize and value the rights of Indigenous nations and peoples, and conduct business in a manner that is built on the foundation of trust, respect, and collaboration. So on the next slide, we have the agenda. So we've scheduled this meeting to last 1.5 hours. We will start with a panel presentation. Afterwards, we will take questions through the Metrolinx Engage webpage, as well as through our Zoom room. So Metrolinx takes safety very seriously. And as such, we begin our meetings with a reflection on a safety moment. Today, I thought I would just provide everyone with a reminder that if you're gardening, be careful of the chemicals that you're using, make sure to wear gloves and read the instructions very well, but also make sure there's no pointy objects on the ground. So be very cautious when you're approaching the gardening. So if we go to the next slide, we're just going to discuss the discussion guide for today. So we're about to move to the presentation, but some quick guidance first. You will be able to follow along with the presentation on your screen, but you can also click on the presentation materials link below and download it for your later reference. If you scroll down, you will also see a number of people that have already submitted a few written questions. We ask that you take a minute to scroll through and upvote any questions that you'd like answered. Great minds think alike, so before you ask a question, see if it's already been asked, and if so, upvote instead. We will answer questions in order of most votes and those that are the most relevant to today's topic. If you prefer to ask a live question, you can join the Zoom room and ask verbally. Click on the yellow Join Zoom Room button to join. My colleague Colin Burns will be moderating the Zoom room tonight. Colin will recognize you when you raise your hand in the Zoom room, and he'll turn on your microphone. We ask that you only ask one question at a time. You can write out your additional questions on the Metrolinx Engage page. We may not get to all of the questions during today's meeting, but we will do our best, and we will absolutely respond to all the written questions on the Engage page following the meeting if we don't get to all of them. Again, if you've just joined us, this meeting is being closed captioned. You can turn on closed captioning by clicking on the CC icon on your video player. So if we go to the next slide, I'll start off by introducing all of your presenters and panel for this evening's meeting. So to start, Kim Story is a founding principal of Brown & Story Architects and has been a respected principal architect and urban designer for more than 30 years. Kim works with clients and stakeholders in close collaboration to identify the goals and programs to be achieved. then carrying those ideas through each stage of the project to ensure design excellence in a responsive environment. Next, we have Lisa McTaggart, and she's an award-winning senior landscape architect and a key member of the community engagement team with Brown & Story. She brings extensive knowledge of all aspects of landscape architecture and the intersection of natural processes with built environment. Next, we have Lorraine Johnson. Lorraine Johnson is a prolific writer and advocate for habitat and landscape design in support of pollinators and wildlife. Lorraine is the author of 10 books, including the forthcoming The Garden for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, Creating Habitat for Native Pollinators, Ontario and Great Lakes edition, co-authored with conservation biologist Sheila Kola. Todd Fell is a landscape architect and restoration ecologist with 23 years of experience in natural heritage characterization and design projects across Southern Ontario. His specialties include detailed design development, ecological restoration, native species garden design, project management, and agency approval process. Finally, your moderator for the panel will be Josh Fullen. Josh Fullen will be your moderator for this evening. He has community engagement experience that spans over 15 years. He's the community engagement lead at Maximum City, leading and advising successful projects for governments, communities, and private enterprise and community engagement, education, and urbanism. So before we begin the presentation, I just wanted to provide a brief overview of the Davenport Greenway project. In April 2021, Metrolinx announced that it awarded the contract to develop the design for the Davenport Greenway to Brown & Story Architects. This design phase of the Greenway project builds on over 5 years of consultations with the community that began with the residents' reference panel in 2015. The feedback from those sessions was exploratory, and most of the recommendations formed the basis of the Greenway design brief, and wherever feasible, included some of the current scope, with the caveat that not all of the suggestions were feasible due to a number of factors. The development of the design is consistent with the input received to date from community groups and municipal stakeholders. Community consultations were vital to setting up the Greenway design for success. The design will reflect the community's needs while ensuring it follows a practical and sustainable framework that will create valuable spaces for future generations to enjoy. The community will have more opportunities to provide feedback during the design process as we share design updates and work towards the 100% design completion milestone with our consultants, Brown & Story, by this summer. Again, I wanted to remind everyone that today's event is entirely focused on plants and pollinators and their habitats. Now, we can go to the next slide, and I will turn it over to Josh, who will set up the panel presentation and then start taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Louisa. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to have you with us for the next 90 minutes. The goal for this evening is really to share knowledge with you, the community, that is both relevant to this project and practical to you. And the secondary goal is to answer as many questions as possible. So we're going to get through the presentation, and I really encourage you to get those questions down as we go, either at the Engage site or through Colin in the Zoom room. And the reason we chose this topic is that the majority of the surface in the Davenport Diamond Greenway is soft landscaping, and that sometimes gets lost or forgotten because the hard infrastructure kind of gets a lot of the attention. But this really is an evening to foreground the conversation in the soft landscape, in the pollinators and the plants and the habitats that surround them. So we think this is a really good opportunity to learn about the project and that feature of the project that is so prominent but kind of lives under the metaphorical and literal shadow of the hard infrastructure, and also answer your questions about spring gardening, whatever they may be. Whether it's your private garden or a community garden space, our experts are eager to hear them and to answer them. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Kim Story, who's going to give you a little bit of a project overview of the Greenway. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you at the end of the presentation when we do the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Josh. I'm Kim Story, and I'm sorry my camera's not working on my laptop tonight, and I've been trying to make it work, but it won't. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. I'm just giving a very brief overview of the project. Really has started with the construction, which is currently under construction, which is the guideway that runs from Bloor to Davenport Road and allows the two train lines, the Barrie line and the CP line, to run separately. What that has done, and here you can see a picture of this, I think, really fabulous formwork for these columns. What this does is unleash a new public realm below that, which we are very, very happy to be working on with this terrific team that we have with Lee Consulting, with our principal landscape architect, Lisa, and Lorraine Johnson, and Todd Fell as well from Duguid Associates. So we're working on the public realm. And if I could go to the next slide, please. And you can see the extent where we have an MSE wall that runs up from Bloor, the far left of that project, and makes a lot of connection points along its length, so that we have connection points at Patton Road, and we have connections going into Eric Crickhorn Park, and then connections into Campbell, Wallace Avenue and Sarnia Avenue, Antler Street, and all of Campbell Park. And then going on to DuPont Street, where we have a connection on 3 levels, really. It's really quite spectacular. And then goes down a ramp, or up a ramp to go over the CP line and over across to the north to the Davenport Road, where we connect back down at Davenport Road. And also making connections into the Davenport Village Park on the way. So it really opens up a really fantastic linear park. And if I could go to the next slide, please. And what happens in that linear park is, as Josh is saying, is a really kind of like, we like to think of it as a sea of landscape, of our special pollinator landscape. And that landscape is set with what we call these small urban rafts, are places to sit and enjoy the landscape and enjoy the views, in this case into Campbell Park. And we have the full MUT, the multi-use cycling path, running all the way from Bloor Street over to Davenport, where it makes connections into Earls Court Park. So we have a number of elements there, but which we'll be updating you in our next public meeting. For now, I'd like to kind of pass this over to our fantastic landscape design team. So Lisa, if you could take it away, please. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. If I could get the next slide. And the next slide. We're approaching the design of the Greenway, as we do with any other public realm project, looking at key themes that will inform each and every design decision that we make. We classified our themes into 10 drivers, but tonight's conversation is really just focused on 2 of them: the maximizing the green and habitat. However, ever present in the background of any landscape project is the unglamorous but absolutely critical drainage driver. So particularly when talking about maximizing the green and creating a wide variety of habitats. The next slide, please. So we're working within the limits of the corridor to create as much habitat as possible. To do this, we have a very extensive plant list, using both herbaceous and woody plants. We've learned an awful lot about establishing native plant landscapes since working on the West Toronto Rail Path many years ago. And now there are so many more sources to actually purchase plants and seeds. And just last week, we actually crunched some of the numbers from our costing data, and the soft landscaping between Wallace and the DuPont ramp actually comprises 58% of the surface area. And if you take out the multi-use trail, that soft landscape represents 70% of all of the treatments within that corridor. Next slide, please. As landscape designers, we look to nature to tell us what might work. We look at the conditions and find cases where they're similar to the conditions that we would anticipate within the Greenway. So what natural ecosystems have similar conditions of light and shade, moisture levels, and the soil type? How does that landscape look through the seasons, especially through winter, because it's just been so darn long, particularly this year. What are the qualities of the spaces we're trying to create? And then we think about constructability. Looking at this cross-section, the typical cross-section of the guideway, elevated guideway, there are two primary characteristics. One part's open to the sky, and the other part's covered by the guideway on the west. Around the multi-use trail, the conditions are very similar to edge conditions found along fence rows or woodlot edges. And edges are very rich ecological places because there are species from both the adjacent communities overlapping and being in the place. So there's a real opportunity there. And we further analyzed the cross-section into 5 distinct landscape types that broadly suit the entire length of the corridor. Next slide, please. The first 3 landscape types are similar in that they are composed of herbaceous plant materials that emerge from the ground at this time of year and die back in the fall, winter. Immediately adjacent to the MUT is a meadow type landscape, because meadows can be both wet and dry, but they have mostly sunlight. They can be short or get really, really tall when they're mature. And they'll be comprised of goldenrods, grasses, milkweeds, sedges, and asters. The glade type is the type of landscape that's found in a clearing of a wooded area and is low growing plants under dappled shade, usually from trees, but in our case, from the guideway. Bergamot, bottlebrush grass, more milkweeds, wood poppy, wild violets, and woodland strawberries will be planted along at the outer edges of the elevated guideway. The glen landscape type is the planted areas that will be doing sort of double duty of holding the soils and filtering the runoff that will be coming down from the elevated guideway within a drainage course between and under the columns. We've been challenging the civil engineers on our team with our requests for broader swales with gentler sides to maximize the actual cross-section of the area of the swale so that we maximize the amount of shade that is a moist soil condition and minimize the amount of dry shade, because dry shade is the hardest place to grow anything. The glen has more types of asters, snakeroot, waterleaf, and anemones, a word that you should never include in a presentation because you muffle it. Next slide, please. The other 2 types of landscapes, thicket and grove, are comprised of mostly woody plants, and they occur less often on the site simply due to the constraints for space. But they're super important for pollinators because, one, they're often the very first sources of nectar. And for us, people, the winter color and structure and textures and form, in addition to the spectacular spring displays, add so much to our landscape design. We're all using them in an architectural way to direct people towards the shortcuts and the loop pathways and prevent the meadow and herbaceous landscapes from trampling, or to use them as screening. We're also strategically placing thickets along the steeper sides of the slopes of the swales, sort of as a natural guardrail. You'll find fragrant sumac, snowberry, and ninebark. We know red osier dogwood, the bottom leftmost image, from its distinctive red twigs, but it has tiny little flowers in the spring and a fruit in the fall. A beaked hazelnut is the plant that I have two pictures of it, just to the right of the dogwood. It has tiny little catkins that are about 4 centimeters long, and they are one of the first things that come out in the spring. And they've been out in my garden for about 3 weeks now. And I've been told that the nuts from a beaked hazelnut are delicious, but my squirrels find them first. With limited airspace, the grove trees and really large shrubs will be limited, but we'll have small groupings of them, and we'll use them to mark intersections or special gathering points as a way to maximize greening. Next slide, please. We have developed our planting palette using what we're calling the toughest of the tough. We have lots of species from the pollinator superfood groups, asters, goldenrods, and sunflowers, and we're trying to provide foraging opportunities throughout the growing season and create shelters. We'll be using a variety of methods to establish this landscape, seeding and planting beds of single species or in combinations of 2 or 3 species, so that overall the landscaping will look intentional and pleasing to all, not just pollinators, but us two-legged creatures as well. Next slide, please. The redbud, on the right, Cercis canadensis, and staghorn sumac to the left are 2 of the species we'll be using in the grove landscape type. Redbud is one of the showiest and earliest to bloom. The trees just hum in the spring with all the winged creatures that are feasting on them. And then this plant is a member of the legume family, and the blossoms will turn into a pod that's like a snow pea shape. And they start out green and then change to brown throughout the winter. And the pods actually hold on throughout the winter, and they make a kind of an interesting rattle sound in the wind. And this particular photo shows a few of those pods are still hanging on from a whole year later while that the plant is in bloom. It's pretty fun to watch chickadees rip those pods apart to get the little seeds from inside. On the right is staghorn sumac, and it's one of those plants that home gardeners are a little wary of because of the way it spreads. But for this corridor, we want those tenacious, perhaps even aggressive, beat 'em back type plants, especially the ones that turn scarlet in the fall and provide such a show. In the winter, their stems are really tactile. They're kind of remind me of reindeer antlers because they're kind of furry. And as an overall mass, they are really a sculptural type plant. Their blooms in the spring aren't showy, but pollinators actually really enjoy them. And then the seed heads are showy and tasty, particularly if you're a frugivore type of bird. And to my last slide. This was taken in my garden a few weeks ago, and the long stalks are from the cup plant. And if we could hit play, it's a video, I believe, I'm hoping. This plant is named for the way that the leaves are arranged on the stem. And right now the cup plants are just emerging in my garden. And they will get taller than all of the Toronto raptors by September. They're rather prehistoric looking. Their leaves are just large and serrated, and but they put out a big bract of daisy type flowers that that all the insects love. And then those flowers turn into seed heads, which are devoured by goldfinches in the fall. And then at the end of the fall and through the winter, they get kind of blown over and knocked down by wind and snow, and create a shelter for ground dwelling creatures. And then the first birds back in the spring dig through that litter for a meal. And with that, I'm going to now hand over to my friend Lorraine. Next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here this evening. Next slide, please. I am going to be talking about who the pollinators are, what the pollinators do, what pollinators need, and how we can support pollinators in our earth care and land tending activities in our gardens and in community gardens, on our balconies, anywhere really. Next slide, please. So bees are the primary pollinators in temperate ecosystems. Most of us, I think, are familiar with one species of bee, the honeybee. Now, the honeybee is an introduced species. It's native to Europe and Asia. And honeybees have, of course, been domesticated for agriculture. So they're really more like managed livestock in a way. But there's a huge diversity of wild native bees in Canada. There are more than 800 different species of bees in this country, and there are more than 350 species of wild bees just in this area, in the Greater Toronto area. Next slide. But bees aren't the only pollinators. Other pollinators include flies, wasps, beetles, moths, butterflies, hummingbirds, basically any creature that that visits the flowers can possibly move pollen unintentionally, but bees have a number of specific features, such as their hairy bodies, or that they visit flowers specifically to collect pollen to take back to their nests. And these are features that make them really excellent pollinators. Next slide, please. If you want to learn more about the bees of Toronto, the City of Toronto has published a wonderful guide called The Bees of Toronto. It's part of the City of Toronto's biodiversity series. And this booklet is available as a download from the City of Toronto's website. And it's also available in hard copy from some libraries. So this is an excellent resource to learn more about these fascinating creatures. Next slide, please. Basically, as Louisa said at the beginning, pollination is the transfer of pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part. And some flowers, called perfect flowers, have both of these, the male and the female parts in the one flower. Some plants have male flowers and separate female flowers on the plant, and some plants are entirely filled with male flowers, and some plants are entirely filled with female flowers. So there's lots of complexity, but basically pollination is how most flowers reproduce. Next slide. And because of this, most plants depend on pollinators to move their pollen in order for the plants to reproduce. Basically, without pollinators, ecosystems would collapse. So they're tiny but mighty creatures, and they're of crucial importance to the ecological functioning of the world. Next slide, please. Of course, for humans, they're incredibly important because about a third of every bite of food that we eat is from a crop that depends on insect pollinators. Now, some crops, like wheat, for example, is wind pollinated. So the pollen moves by the action of the wind. But as I said, about a third of the world's food crops do depend on animals to move the pollen. Plus, there are some crops, really important crops like blueberries, tomatoes, melons, squashes, apples, cranberries, eggplants, and peppers. These are plants that are best, and in some cases only, pollinated by native bumblebees and some other types of bees, not honeybees, that can, so they're only pollinated by native bees that can do something called buzz pollination. They basically vibrate the flowers to release the pollen. And without that action, the pollen would not be released. So the native bees are incredibly important for these crops in particular. Next slide. In terms of what pollinators need, they basically need the same things that all living beings need. They need food and shelter and somewhere to nest, somewhere that meets their particular nesting needs. So, for example, in the ground, about 70% of native bees nest in the ground. About 30% nest in the stem cavities in plants. There's even a native bee that nests in snail shells. So along with food in the form of pollen and nectar to feed themselves and their larvae, and plants on which to lay their eggs or nesting areas in which to lay their eggs, they also need areas that are free of pesticides, and they need overwintering sites. For the native bees for the majority of native bees that nest in the ground, they need patches of bare ground in which to burrow. What also helps in terms of habitat for bees, a diverse array of landscape features like rocks or dead wood, dead stems, leaves, mud. There are even some bees that depend on the oils and resins of plants. So all of these features that support the various habitat and nesting needs of diverse pollinator species. It's really quite specific in terms of what each pollinator, what each specific species will use, but in the broad sense, they basically need what we all need and what all creatures need: food and a safe place. Next slide, please. Although there is an awful lot that scientists don't know, for example, the number of insects species that there actually are in the world, it's only a guess at this point, an estimate. There's so much that's not known. But what is known is that many species of pollinators are in trouble. Many species are experiencing decline, some very dramatically, with huge losses, especially in the past few decades. And one of the reasons for these declines relates to habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. Those are some of the reasons. There are others. So what can we do? What can we do to help pollinators? We can plant native plants and create habitat. Next slide, please. So why this emphasis on native plants in particular? Why focus on native plants? And just to give a brief definition of native plants are the plants that have been in a region for a very, very long time. Kind of think of an evolutionary time scale. So in hundreds and hundreds, even millennia. And over that long evolutionary time scale, they've evolved, the plants have evolved in association with everything else in the region, like all the other creatures here, the climate, the soils, the microorganisms, the rainfall. And over that evolutionary time, they've developed important and in many cases dependent relationships, the plants and the insects together. Monarchs and milkweeds are maybe the best known example of these co-evolved relationships between plants and insects. So milkweed is the only known larval host plant for monarch butterflies. So in their larval stage, when they're caterpillars, monarch caterpillars can only survive on milkweed plants. Without milkweed, there'd be no monarchs. So that's a very familiar, dependent, co-evolved relationship within the ecosystem between plants and insects. But these sorts of co-evolved relationships can be found throughout the ecosystem. About 90% of the insects that eat plants that are herbivores are specialists on native plants. So native plants are crucial for the health of insects, and insects through pollination are crucial for plants. Next slide, please. So one of the ways to support pollinators is to plant native plant habitat gardens and to support and encourage these co-evolved relationships. Of course, protecting and conserving existing habitat is also important, but creating habitat is something that we can do in community spaces, on balconies, in yards and gardens. Next slide, please. In terms of how to go about designing a garden or any landscape specifically for pollinators, there are some general design principles that will really lead to success. The first one is to plant native plants in masses, so about 3 to 5 plants of each species in clusters. And this provides bees in particular. Bees have a trait known as floral constancy, which means they'll visit the same plants, the same species of plants over and over in one foraging trip. And this is one of the reasons why they're such great pollinators. So if you plant in masses, you'll be supporting bees in that way. You'll be providing these abundant foraging opportunities. It's also really important because different species of bees have different life cycles. You know, some are active in the spring, some are active in the summer, some have a very small period in which they have to collect all the pollen and nectar to provision their nests. Some have long periods of foraging, like throughout the growing season, but with this huge diversity of needs that different species of bees have, it's important to plant a diversity of plants species. So plants with different colors, plants with different flower shapes, and plants that have different blooming periods, so that your pollinator habitat, it's important to have plants in bloom throughout the growing season to meet the needs of bees that have that might have a particular time in which they're foraging, let's say in the early spring. So have spring blooming plants, and then, you know, as the season moves on, more plants that are blooming in the summer and plants that are blooming in the fall. Fall is a very important time for many species of pollinators, especially for butterflies, because butterflies are also pollinators. And the butterflies that migrate, like the monarchs, they have to fuel that migration, that huge long migration to Mexico. So fall blooming plants are very important. So continuous bloom from spring to fall is very important. As I mentioned earlier, leaving some bare ground for ground nesting bees is important. Of course, mulching is a fabulous garden maintenance. It's important for garden maintenance. It conserves water in the soil. It prevents weeds. So mulch is important, but be sure to leave some bare ground for the ground nesting bees. And at the end of the season, so in the fall, leave those dead stems And for plants that have hollow stems, many plants, the cup plant Lisa mentioned, that has a hollow stem, and it's great for cavity nesting bees. So it's important to leave those stems standing because the bees will use them over winter and for nesting. Also include features like rocks and decorative deadwood. And I don't really like that word deadwood because actually in many ways old logs and other pieces of dead wood, it's actually quite alive. There are loads of decomposer insects that use it. They return the nutrients found in the wood to the soil. They're soil building insects. So, and these are soil building features and their habitat. Old logs, beetles will create little cavities and holes in them, which are used by bees for nests. As I mentioned earlier, don't use pesticides, no chemicals in a pollinator garden, and avoid cleaning up your garden in spring or in the autumn. Leave all of those dead leaves, their habitat for those insects. There are insects using them for nesting. There are insects using them to find food. So leave those materials will slowly decompose. And in fact, if you've got dead leaves in your garden now, they'll be pulled into the soil by earthworms by the early summer, and you won't even see those dead leaves as the plants grow up. Next slide, please. Some maintenance tips to support and protect pollinators, some gardening maintenance tips. I mentioned leaving the leaves. This is so important. Leave the leaves in the fall. Now, I know that if you've got a lawn, for example, you can't have too thick a layer of leaves in the lawn, but in a garden patch that you're growing for pollinators, leave those leaves piled up. There are so many different species of pollinators that use dead leaves as habitat. There's the morning cloak butterfly, for example. It overwinters in dead leaves as an adult. So even it's hard to imagine, but they survive, they hibernate through the winter in those dead leaves. So it's important that we don't rake them up and send them away, because basically then we're sending away pollinators to be composted or thrown out. Oh, I'm sorry. There. So leave them where they fall. Rather than cut down those spent stalks, leave them, I mentioned, for the wild bees to the cavity nesting bees, and these small logs can be quite ornamental features in a garden. They can be design features. Next slide, please. So when you create habitat with native plants for pollinators in your yard, the local park, the community garden, your boulevards, for example, anywhere and everywhere, on balconies, in pots, on the porch, you're helping to build ribbons of connected habitat, basically resilient and healthy ecosystems for pollinators. And this is so important, especially in the context of climate change, when species are moving their ranges in response to a changing climate. So these stepping stones of habitat for pollinators are crucial, because many insects are small and only travel short distances. So bees, for example, some just they only travel about 500 meters up to a couple of kilometers. So having these connected habitats across the landscape, what you plant, any native plants that you plant, whether it's just a few in a pot, a couple in your garden, these are so important because they are providing habitat for these tiny creatures that need habitat. Next slide, please. I'd like to end with one of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which talks, in this particular action, talks about the need to reconcile with nature and the natural world, and to build a relationship with nature. And that if we continue to destroy the natural world, then reconciliation remains incomplete. I think that creating and maintaining habitat in yards or other community spaces is a meaningful way to really learn and engage with nature where we live. It's a way to build that relationship with nature, and that's one of the steps for reconciling with nature. When you plant and maintain habitat for pollinators, the bees and butterflies and birds will bring life to the landscape and to your home place. Thank you. Over to you, Todd.
Thanks, Lorraine. Always so interesting listening to you speak. Thank you so much. I'll be speaking about health and resilience tonight. It's a little bit more of an esoteric topic, so I hope I can keep everyone engaged. Next slide, please. So I was thinking about where to begin. So let's start with this thought. Humans are not separated from nature. Ecology and ecosystems are everywhere. Human landscapes and natural landscapes are different, but even in the urban core of a city, there are interacting species that interact with each other and their environment. I'm sure anyone from Toronto who has met a raccoon out during the evening can attest to this truth. However, ecosystems like humans can get out of shape. So tonight we've been talking about enhancing the ecology of the Davenport Diamond Greenway, in an effort to improve its health and resiliency. So what does this mean? In talking about health and resiliency, the main message that I'd like to convey tonight is A, that there's a range or a continuum for ecosystems from a degraded and simple system on the low end to a healthy and diverse system on the high end. And B, that the goal of the landscape team for the Davenport Diamond Greenway is to take the first steps on the path to recovery and shift the position of the public realm further up that continuum towards a healthy and diverse ecosystem. So what is health and resilience for an ecosystem, and why is it important? A healthy ecosystem is one in which structure and function sustain native biodiversity, biotic integrity, and ecological processes over time. Resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to recover and sustain biodiversity and integrity after a disturbance. And so together, these two parameters are measures of an ecosystem position on that continuum. It gives us a way to view the progress the Davenport Greenway on its road to recovery. So that's all a bit of a mouthful. So let's break that down a bit. Let's go to the next slide. So let's dig a little deeper and tell a story that will paint us a picture of the Greenway's journey. We'll look first at a healthy and resilient reference system to see what that high end of the continuum looks like. And then for contrast, we'll look at a system in its degraded state. And last, we'll come back to the Greenway and what the landscape team is doing to restore functionality and improve the health and resilience of the system. Let's go to the next slide. Healthy and resilient systems. So let's move the slide forward again, please. So for this part of the story, I want you to think of a picture. The picture is made up of hundreds of thousands of points of color that represent components of a vast ecosystem. When you zoom out, the individual parts function together to form a high-resolution image, and you can see the air and the sky, the earth, the rocks and soils, the water in the ponds, rivers, and the shore of a lake or the sea. And among these elements, there is life, the plants, the trees, the shrubs and herbs, the animals from insects to birds, reptiles and amphibians, mammals, and all the microorganisms. But when we zoom in close to see the interactions between all of these components, there are many complex relationships between the biotic and the abiotic, or the non-living components. There is diversity. The species have evolved and adapted alongside each other, and they function together in a community. So one example we can actually see right now in some of the remaining forests in Ontario. The snow has melted, the rains have begun. Fortunately, we didn't have that today. But there is water on the landscape forming small pools and swelling rivers. The floodplains and the ponds have got visitors. The frogs and the salamanders are coming out of the soil where they have overwintered and down from the forests to mate in the pools formed from the spring waters. The young amphibians emerge from their eggs as an aquatic, water-breathing creature for the first part of their lives before a miraculous transformation, turning into their adult forms, and they return to the air and the water's edge or back to the deep forest soils. They feed on the insects like mosquitoes and in turn are prey for snakes and birds like herons. They exist together as a community in their habitat upon the landscape within time. Next slide, please. If we zoom out again, we see that this picture has other difficult to see components. There is energy from the sun, the wind, gravity, flows of water and waves. The whole thing exists across space, the landscape, which is connected, and the patterns shift across it, making the picture like a mosaic of all the pieces within it. And we can see also that this picture is not static. It exists within time and it changes. Every year we see birth, death, growth, and decay. Abiotic components interact with energy and create cycles of weather, water, and nutrients. And sometimes these interactions create disturbances, such as fire, floods, and ice that disrupt the living plants and the animals. But the ecosystem is diverse. There are plants and animals that are adapted to almost every change on the landscape. And in a diverse system, they can be recruited to areas of disturbance and initiate the recovery of that system. The ecosystem is resilient and healthy and can persist across space and time, and it is adapted to the landscape mosaic and the changes through time. Next slide, please. We'll have a little look at a disturbed system now. So let's move the slide forward again. So, pardon me. We're going to keep our picture in mind as we move into a disturbed system. But in this case, we're looking at an urban setting. There is still air in the sky, but there are many differences. The points that make up the picture are fewer. Instead of a detailed portrait, we're looking at a handful of colors and blocky shapes. Maybe sort of like Minecraft for those who might be familiar with that. The living components are only the generalist species that can survive in harsh conditions, and often they are exotic species that have been brought to the landscape where local species have not adapted to their presence. They're not often not adapted to their communities, and they may have no predators, limiting their spread, or they may impact native populations by over-consuming species that have no defenses against them. The abiotic components are missing or disturbed. Notably, the soils are only rare patches and often shallow, or they're overlying other built components. Water is also rare on the landscape. Rain does not stay. There are no soils to infiltrate into, and it quickly runs off the roofs, the sidewalks, and the roads, where it is captured in storm sewers and conveyed directly into receiving systems. Rivers often flow low or dry and then suddenly flood with high velocity flows after a storm. This is a challenging environment. The flows of energy, space, and time are disrupted. The roofs and roads have little protection from the sun and heat and light. Conversely, buildings can exclude sunlight, creating deep shade. Natural disturbances like flooding, fire are prevented, and cycles of death and rebirth that create organics for insects and soil structure are interrupted by leaf cleanup, such as been mentioned during Lorraine's discussion, or the tidying of the landscape. Artificial disturbances are introduced, preventing natural recovery, including things like mowing or even encroachment, like feet on the ground, to things like pollution, road salt. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We're shifting our picture now to look back at the Greenway. We are looking to increase the resolution and the complexity of our image, and we come full circle back to this discussion that Lisa began for us. The strategy for augmenting this image is in enhancement, relationships, and connections. We will enhance the biotic components, selecting native species that form natural communities. This will increase biodiversity and expand habitat opportunities as discussed by Lorraine. The communities will have a relationship with their environment. They will be adapted to the soils, to water and energy cycles, and thrive due to their fit within the greater picture. And those communities will form a mosaic upon the landscape, creating a connected corridor where each community contributes to the ecology of the Greenway as a whole. Next slide, please. So here we have a few residents from two different communities. Spicebush, which is a shrub adapted to moisture and shadier conditions. It's a native species adapted to thrive in woodlands and edges, where it provides structure and forage for wildlife, and its roots hold the soils. Its leaves and branches protect the herbs growing underneath. And our second resident, wild strawberry, is native to meadows and barrens, where conditions are bright and dry. It spreads across the ground between stems of taller species, and it shades the soil as well as providing a valued treat to wildlife when its berries ripen. Next slide. Even the abiotic components, the non-living components in our picture, can increase in resolution and complexity. We can enhance these components by removing hard surfaces like concrete and asphalt and replacing them with soils. This creates surface diversity that enables relationships. The soils form relationships with other elements in our picture, providing a substrate for the living roots of plants. The soils interact with water by attenuating the flows during a rain event and allowing for infiltration, forming reservoirs for biota during drier times. The mosaic picture of soil and water connects the image, and we are looking at a greenway that is more diverse in living and non-living components, interacting with each other across the landscape and the cycles of time. But we still have to think about disturbances. Human use and maintenance of the greenway can disrupt the natural cycles. But the team will be looking at ways to facilitate human use and enjoyment of the Greenway without impacting the recovery and sustainability of the enhanced ecology. The landscape team will be looking carefully at reducing these impacts through design, through alternative management, and through education and stewardship for its users. Next slide, please. So a few final words. Last year, the United Nations declared 2021 to 2030 the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration. There is no better time to be introducing restoration actions in the urban environment. As we have seen, the Davenport Diamond Greenway enhances the urban ecology by selecting native species, by providing habitat opportunities, and permitting natural functions in the urban landscape. The enhancements support the sustainability of native biodiversity, biotic integrity, and ecological processes over time. And care will be taken to design the accompanying public realm to reduce urban disturbances and allow the novel ecosystems to perpetuate with reduced recovery stress. While not the same as an intact native reference ecosystem, this does take the first steps on the path to recovery, and it shifts the position of the public realm for the Davenport Diamond Greenway further up the continuum towards a healthy and resilient ecosystem. And as one final side note, the International Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, recently released a report. It was April 4th, and it shows restoration to be a key factor in reducing greenhouse gas, and therefore is an important tool in combating climate change. So another critical benefit of restoration of our landscapes, contributing to global ecological health and resilience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd, Lorena, and Lisa. Totally fascinating stuff. Really eager to get to the questions. I just ask that we go to the next slide while I set up sort of the process for that. We can go to the next slide again, please. So just a reminder for the discussion guide, you can ask a question at least two ways, either verbally in the Zoom room, Colin will help you with that. He can unmute you if you want to ask your question verbally, or you can type it into the chat and he'll read it out. If your question is for a specific panelist, please identify that. We're going to try and have only one panelist answer each question to sort of reach that goal of answering as many questions as possible. And just a reminder that respect is our guide. I do ask that you focus your question on plants and pollinators so that we can squeeze as much knowledge out of these three folks as we can in the next 30 minutes. I mean, I was taking notes as we went and just sort of thinking about the complexity of the systems in the Greenway and sort of also the simplicity of the constituent elements that make up those systems. So just lots of interesting stuff. Also heard Lorraine say that I don't have to rake my leaves in the fall, which I will thank her for, and glad this is being recorded. So for our first question, I'm going to go to the Metrolinx Engage site, and I'm not sure who would want to answer this, but I'll let the panelists self-organize. What should I plant, this question asks, in my balcony container garden? So we know now that almost half of Toronto lives in an apartment of some kind, and lots of apartments around the Greenway as well. So I'm assuming this person lives in a mid-rise or a high-rise and is asking what they should plant in their balcony container gardens. Over to you, panel.
Perhaps I could suggest some species, because ones that immediately come to mind, if the balcony is a sunny spot, I would highly recommend some native plants like black-eyed Susan. This is very easy to grow in a container. Or wild bergamot, another very easy to grow plant for a container. Pearly everlasting. These are great in sunny conditions. And Todd mentioned the wild strawberry. So you can plant that in containers and you can harvest food. You can have edible, delicious wild strawberries. They're tiny, but they are flavor packed. So looking to the native meadow species is the way to go for a sunny balcony. Now, if you've got shady conditions, there are actually some wonderful sedges and woodland grasses that you can plant in a container, like bottlebrush grass, for example, or Pennsylvania sedge. Those would be good choices. I don't know if Lisa or Todd, you want to add some of your favorites for containers.
Can I actually return a question to you, Lorraine? What would you say about non-herbaceous plants like woodies?
In containers.
Yeah, I had a few in mind, but I just wanted to hear what you might recommend.
Well, I would recommend large containers.
Yeah.
Large containers, but I would actually recommend, if you've got a large container, you can even consider a larger, I've seen chokeberry in, so it's a native shrub. It can grow, even 3 to 5, sometimes 5 feet tall, and it produces also edible fruit. And it can take some shade. If you've got sunny spot, New Jersey tea would be one of the woody shrubs that you could plant in a container. So those would be some I suggest. Or I would also suggest you could even consider some woody vines kind of rambling along. Todd, what did you have in mind?
I love to take ideas from nature, and I was on a walk. Some of my favorite walks are along the escarpment, and you see these ancient cedars growing out of the rock. And I wondered to myself whether or not that meant that I didn't require large soil volumes if I was to try and grow a cedar in a planter. I have a backyard, but my mother has a balcony. And so we tried it. And as long as you make sure that you let it, I sound like CBC gardening host Ed Lawrence here, but you have to let it dry out between waterings. And that works pretty well too. And it kind of mimics the natural conditions that you see in some places of Ontario.
Thanks so much, Lorraine and Todd, for that answer. Hopefully that gives some tips and ideas to the person who asked it. I'm going to go over to the Zoom room and see if there are any questions there. Colin, do you have a question from any of the community members in the Zoom room?
Hi, Josh, thanks. We don't actually have any questions right now, but it's just a reminder, a live reminder to everyone in the Zoom room. If you do have a question, you can raise your hand or type in the chat and I can read it out for you. So just let me know. But right now we don't have any, Josh, so back to you for Engage questions.
Okay, thank you, Colin. So next question from the Engage site, and this came up during the presentation. What is the plan to manage invasive species? So lots of talk really throughout in terms of the types of plants, the native plants and the hardy plants that will thrive and are necessary for sustaining the ecosystem. But what is the plan for managing invasive plants?
I guess I better take that one. So we're hoping to really minimize from the get-go the invasive species. There were a huge number of invasive species within the corridor before construction started. And the process of constructing the diversion track and then building the elevated guideway has really removed all of the organic material that invasive species would be growing in. And that soil, we're going to be starting with a completely new soil. So the first thing that we're going to do is when we get the soil put down, we are going to use a nurse crop so that the soil is never left bare for just anything to occur. And so we're going to have a seed mix with a number of different types of annual herbaceous material that will go down immediately after the fine grading, the topsoil placement and fine grading is done. Because native plants don't necessarily they don't grow just as soon as they get water and light. They grow with a season, and so we won't be able to plant the native plant seeds until it's the right time for them to germinate. And so we'll use this nurse crop to kind of hold the soil. So we'll put down two types of seed right from the beginning. And hopefully we will have a good enough catch that there will be little room for invasive plants to even get a foothold, because we are just going to sort of throw everything at the site and sort of tie it up in the plants that we want. There will be in the specifications a management component during the establishment period so that we can make sure that if another round of nurse crop seed needs to go down, that will happen during the implementation of this landscape. And I hope that answers the question. I don't know if Todd, if you have anything to add that might that I might have missed.
I thought it was pretty good. From an ecological perspective, we always think about recruitment, and in urban systems where there is no natives and we have constant disturbance that is opening up new ground, we get opportunity for invasives to establish. But what we're doing is as you discussed, we're eliminating that startup opportunity. And we're managing it not in a disturbed state, so that opportunity for recruitment has basically been eliminated. So from a process point of view, that's the logic of it, and you described it perfectly. So
thanks, Todd.
Yes, thank you, Todd, and thanks, Lisa, for that answer. I'm not seeing any other questions on the Engage site. So while the folks in the Zoom room maybe think about questions, I am going to ask a question on behalf of my daughter, who is obsessed with bees. She read in one of the books we read together, she read that if bees became extinct, the planet itself would be in trouble. And sort of Lorraine spoke to that a little bit in her section in Pollinators in Peril. And to that point, we heard on the radio that this year's bee harvest was quite low. The yield was incredibly low. So the bee farmers, you know, when they went to look at their stock of bees that came out this year was very low. So what is the implication of that for the health of an ecosystem like the Greenway? And I think that one's for you, Lorraine.
Thank you for that, Josh, and well, thank you to your daughter. So I think what your daughter's referring to in terms of hearing recently about the bees not coming through, that's something called colony collapse disorder, which affects honeybees, and that the news from the recent news about what beekeepers managing the livestock of honeybees have, the initial word anyway, is that a lot of the hives have basically died over the winter. And this problem of colony collapse disorder is something that really is affecting honeybees. And the thing about honeybees being a managed species, like a domesticated livestock, basically, is that when a colony dies, as the reports are coming through, colonies of honeybees dying this over the winter, beekeepers can basically buy a new queen and start a new colony. So it is a kind of agricultural system. In terms of the impact of honeybee deaths and colony collapse disorder on the Greenway, on the Davenport Diamond Project, we're planting and designing to support wild bees, which are not impacted by colony collapse disorder. So we're actually creating and supporting the most the most healthful opportunities for the wild bees to thrive and survive. So, as I said, some of the wild bees are definitely in trouble and declining, but projects like the Greenway, planting native plants for the health of pollinators, will provide what the wild bees need. And as for the honeybees, colony, there are a lot of people working on the causes of colony collapse disorder and why that's happening and how to keep honeybee hives healthy. But it's landscapes like this that help to keep wild bees healthy.
Thank you, Lorraine. Appreciate that, and I will pass that information on. There's a new question on the Engage site, so I'm going to go over and read that one out. How are the plants going to be maintained? So kind of a two-parter. How will you stop the plants from being trampled too much? And are they going to be replanted every year if they don't come in again? So I don't know if Lisa, you want to take that, or somebody else? I will leave it up to you.
I guess I'll give it a start. So once the meadow and the glade and the glen plants get well established, they're pretty resilient. It's that point in time when the Greenway might be open because everything's built, but the plants are still little. So we'll have to sort of fence it off in a temporary sort of way to get that landscape established. The other thing we're doing is we're trying to provide in the actual hardscape design, the layout of the pathways, and we're trying to make sure that we provide a good connection. Everywhere people are going to want a connection and anticipate those desire lines. We're also using the shrubs in a way to kind of direct people towards, sort of to kind of manage behavior in terms of the design. Another trick that we have up our sleeves is the slope of the ground surface. So in some areas where we really don't want people to walk through, we're going to actually make it a little bit uncomfortable to do that, but provide a very comfortable, welcoming way, alternate route for that. So the other advantage of the kind of landscape that we're using with this herbaceous material is every season these plants will grow, and they will, once they're established, they will flower or blossom and set seed. And those seeds will stay in the landscape. Like, we're not going to cut them before they've matured. They will be viable seeds, and the reality is that the pollinators and the birds are not going to, and squirrels are not going to be able to eat every one of them. There will be spillage onto the ground, and they, again, these types of plants actually are more successful at germinating when they're in an environment, if there's room, bare soil available for them to hit that ground, they will germinate and produce new plants. And so we're really hoping, we're setting up the soil, the type of soil that we have, and then the organic content in that soil that we're constructing. Initially, we're setting that up to be healthy for this ecosystem to actually go through its own life cycle and be regenerative and resilient. And there will be points in time where these plants reach kind of their end of their life, but they should be healthy enough that they will then ensure their future generations to grow. And so we're also using, as I mentioned, we're using the toughest of the tough. All of the plants that are on the beat them back kind of, we're not using any of the fragile, need a whole bunch of special conditions to occur all at once to grow. So we've got a lot of goldenrods and asters and things that you often can see along existing rail corridors that can compete in that sort of unmanaged landscape as well. I don't know if Todd, if you have any other things that we're doing. I pretty much got it. Lorraine's nodding too. Thank you.
See a thumbs up from Todd. Thanks so much, Lisa, for that answer. We do have more questions on the Engage server, but we're gonna go to the Zoom room and ask Colin to read one out. Colin, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Yeah, so the question is, in the same way that the Greenway is making hard connections to streets and parks, can we imagine that the pollinator landscape can also make connections to the surrounding yards and gardens?
Yeah, really good question. I don't know who wants to start there, but maybe that's one each of you could take a pass at, because that's a really rich one. So over to you folks.
I can start with the simple answer and just say yes. No, that's really good. I mean, consolidate, link, and enhance is a bit of my motto for restoration. You want to consolidate habitat, link it where you can, and then enhance its content, its biodiversity. So where there are existing patches of nature, and I talked about that continuum in my talk, and so that nature doesn't have to be that reference system. If it's a park, it might not be in the best position, but it's still something that can provide an ecological benefit, especially when it's in connection with other elements of the landscape, and it forms that mosaic patchwork landscape that I talk about. And diversity occurs at a genetic level, it occurs at a species level, it occurs in communities, but it occurs across the landscape as well. And so, yeah, I think that that ribbon, that corridor that we're creating is connected internally and through the elements that we're bringing to the landscape as a design team. But yes, it's connected out into the existing landscape, parks, yards, the urban canopy. Yes.
Thank you, Todd. Lorraine or Lisa?
I would like to echo Todd's enthusiastic yes. And one of the ways that I'm hopeful about some of the connections that can be made is that the Greenway is going to be a seed nursery. It's going to be a seed nursery for the community in a way. You know, the birds are going to move those seeds, and the birds are going to plant more pollinator habitat because the habitat will be there in the Greenway. And then also I'm hopeful that as an inspiring landscape, it will lead to more pollinator habitat in the community because people are inspired by the Greenway and what they see there, and see all of the birds and bees and butterflies and other creatures who are attracted to and supported by that habitat. And so it will inspire people to create more pollinator landscape in the community. I'm not quite sure if that's what your question was asking, but that's kind of where I took it. But yes.
Right, so 2 yeses so far. I'm Lisa, I'm guessing you're going to be the third assenter here. Go ahead.
Yes, yes, I am, and yes. The other thing that I think might happen is one of the things my kids would do when we would go to places is that they would pick seed heads and make little collections of things. And if you walk a dog and they pick up little things, that some of the plants actually have little things that grab onto you to get to a new location. So there'll be many ways that the plant species. Now we're trying to plant mostly polite plants, but you know there will be some interesting berries and things that people might be tempted to pick up, and hopefully they'll feel free to propagate them in their own gardens.
Isn't that called guerrilla gardening?
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for that answer. So you mentioned dogs, Lisa, which is a good segue to the latest question on the Engage site. And this one, I have to say, resonates with me. What do you recommend for a garden that gets a lot of dog pee? I have lots of canine neighbors on my street. I'm not sure you have a solution for this, any of you, but maybe you have some advice. I'm not sure. Go ahead.
I would certainly suggest a small, lovely, creative sign that planted in the garden that shares what if you've planted a pollinator garden, for example, have a nice little sign that says, habitat for monarchs or something like that, that might encourage people to encourage an appreciation for the garden that might help them keep dogs out. You could also put a little sign about please no dogs, or a small. I've been involved with a public pollinator patch on Portland, down by King and Spadina area, and it's there are a lot of dogs living in those condos, and people walk, and not many places for the dogs to not many natural areas for them or parks. So the dogs are in the garden, but so we put up a beautiful and low rope fence. It's just little pieces of wood. They're only like little posts, I guess, but they're small, and they're about 6 or 8 inches tall with a hole drilled in, and then we put just a piece of rope, and it's the gentlest fence I've ever seen, and it gets the message out there. Please keep keep your dogs. This is a garden. So those are some suggestions that I'd have.
And Josh,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Lisa.
One of the things that I did, because my native garden goes right to the sidewalk edge, and right at the corner, I have sort of a little sculptural wood. So I have some old wood, an interesting log, and there's one piece that's sort of this kind of sculpture right at the corner that is kind of this sacrificial pea post. And so I've actually, it kind of looks like it's to maintain the corner so that my kids don't drive the car over my garden. But it also is the spot where every dog in the neighborhood checks the pea mail.
So we have an appeal to the better angels of our nature from Lorraine, and sort of a first line of defense, and sort of sacrificing a bit of something from Lisa.
It just consolidates it into one sort of. It really does. They don't use any other part of my frontage now.
Very good. So I'm gonna go back to Colin, because I believe there is another question from the Zoom room. We've just got a few minutes left, so I'm gonna this may be our last question, depending on how long the answer is, and then we'll thank everyone for coming and say good evening, and go Raptors. Okay, over to you, Colin.
Thanks, Josh. Yes, the question is, all this talk of attracting bees, what about people who are afraid of things that can sting them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it comes up a lot. So I guess it's important to kind of, think about, okay, there might be a different answer if you are highly allergic to, and you have an anaphylactic reaction. That's one thing. But if you are just sort of worried about getting stung because it might hurt, bees are actually for the most part, gentle creatures. The only female bees sting, for one thing, so the males are not stinging. Some bee species can't even sting humans, like their stingers are too small, they won't puncture skin. But the times when any bees will actually be aggressive, it's when they're defending their nests, and most solitary bees, they don't defend, and most native bees are solitary bees. They're not defending a nest. So I think it's important to keep in mind that for the most part, if you're not, getting bees, if you're not getting bees caught in your clothing, they'll sting then. But for the most part, if you're just observing bees nectaring at flowers, for example, they're not interested, and they're not going to be aggressive towards you in any way. So for the most part, think of the bees as your friend, be calm around them, and you'll be fine.
Thanks, Lorraine. Lisa, do you have a 30-second addendum to add to that? And then I'm going to turn it over to Louisa to say good evening.
I just want to add that most bees don't have a nest to protect, and as long as you're not squishing them so that they are like pulling out a weed that they're on or something, they really they leave you alone.
Appreciate that. Thanks to the three of you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge. I'll be looking back at this recording to sort of look at it more deeply and get that knowledge again. I really appreciate sort of the time and the effort that went into this. We have a minute left, so I'm going to turn it over to Louisa and thank everyone for joining us. Louisa, over to you.
Thank you, Josh, and everyone for presenting today. We learned so much about pollinators and plants and so much great information about bees. On the previous slide, you'll see how to stay in touch with us. Here is all the information. You can follow us on Twitter at Go Expansion, subscribe to our Toronto West e-newsletter, and get updates at our website, metrolinx.com/Davenport. I just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in today. I'm looking forward to rewatching today's presentation as well for all the details and fascinating information. Again, I wanted to thank everyone for staying in touch, and please stay safe, have a great evening, and go Raptors.